Brian, we have a little bit of a technical glitch. Want to make sure that we can live stream this somehow, because I think it's important for people to be able to hear what's going to be said here today. So anybody who wants to who's better, more technologically advanced than I am, is more than welcome to sit anywhere you want to get this important testimony. But I think we need to make sure that what is being said here today is heard loud and clear. The second thing I want to apologize, I think there are a lot of people who are very much interested, a lot of members interested in this, but unbeknownst to all of us, we were supposed to be in session today, but the Speaker decided to call it quits last night for the weekend. But nonetheless, we're only going to be here for a couple of days next week, so postponing this hearing, I think, was not an option. And I think, again, the situation is such that we need to have a discussion. We need to get some information out. We need people to pay attention. So, having said that, I want to wish everybody a good morning, and I want to welcome you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing titled Syria's Humanitarian Crisis, What More Can We Do? I also, I'm going to acknowledge our witnesses in a couple of minutes, but I do want to mention a couple of people here today. Catherine Porter, who is a longtime human rights advocate, but I always want people to understand, before there was a commission, there was a Tom Lantos Human Rights Caucus that Catherine helped establish several years ago. So we wouldn't be here as a commission if there wasn't a caucus, and the caucus wouldn't be here if it wasn't in large part for Catherine. So I wanted to acknowledge her. My friend Bill Stubner with the Syrian American Medical Society, who has been relentless in calling attention to some of the atrocities going on. I've known him for many years, going back to the 1980s and early 90s when we worked on human rights issues in El Salvador. So I appreciate his involvement. And I want to also acknowledge Michael Kane from the Valley Syrian Relief Committee in Massachusetts, in my congressional district. People sometimes in Washington wonder, does anybody care outside of the Beltway? Well, I can assure you that, at least in my congressional district, lots and lots of people care. And the Valley Syrian Relief Committee, again, has educated me and has been a constant reminder that the world is not doing enough and not doing what it should be to help the Syrian people. And there's a lot of other people here who I know, and I probably shouldn't have started recognizing people. But anyway, I especially, again, want to welcome our witnesses today. I want to thank them for their dedication to the well-being of the people of Syria and their perseverance in seeking to uphold human rights and international humanitarian norms in the midst of the Syrian civil war. Let me begin by saying that I deeply regret and strongly condemn the renewed bombings of civilians, medical facilities, and humanitarian aid convoys by forces under the command of President Assad and Russia in recent days. Today's renewed bombing of Aleppo signals an end to the ceasefire that was just put into place a few days back and makes even more difficult the path to ending the Syrian conflict. Nonetheless, I hope and expect the United States to persevere in its diplomatic path, because there is no alternative. We are here today because we are all appalled by the brutality of the Syrian conflict, and in particular its impact on civilians. In war, we expect killing, but it's combatants whose killing is technically legal. The killing of non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, the disabled, and anyone else not wearing a uniform or carrying a gun is generally illegal under international humanitarian law and immoral and unjustified in the minds of most people. If there must be war, civilians are supposed to be protected. But as we are only too well aware, in Syria, civilians have borne the brunt of the impact of the war. It's not just a question of deaths, although the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights has documented nearly 87,000 civilian dead, including thousands are children and youth, out of an estimated 430,000 killed to date. It's the 6.5 million people who have been forcibly displaced within the country and the 4.8 million who have been forced to flee Syria. Half of the country's population has been uprooted. In terms of sheer numbers, the Syrian conflict has generated the largest humanitarian crisis the world has seen since World War II. At the beginning of 2016, the United Nations expected that 13.5 million people affected by the Syrian conflict would need humanitarian assistance during this year. I think people get overwhelmed by these numbers, even as we are brought to tears by the photo of a single child dead on a beach or alive in an ambulance. I sometimes worry that all the numbers and the statistics, which are so daunting, result in our inability to feel what is happening, and that worries me deeply. We could spend a lot of time analyzing how we got here, but that is not our purpose today. I would just note for the record that the initial protests in 2011 were peaceful and motivated by genuine, long-standing grievances against a regime that has been ruled by the same family for over 4 decades. It's not the origins of the opposition movement that set Syria apart. It's the way the government has prosecuted the war, its purposeful, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, the use of chemical weapons, aerial bombardment of opposition areas, the continual targeting of medical personnel and facilities, the besieging of cities, the denial of humanitarian access. Away from the battlefield, as documented by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry in August, civilians are, quote, disappeared, taken hostage, tortured, and subjected to sexual violence, end quote. Unlawful killings are a hallmark of this blood-soaked conflict. The Syrian government is not the only party to the conflict that systematically ignores human rights and international humanitarian law. Also, in its August report, the IICI report reported that from February to June of this year, indiscriminate attacks by ISIL using IEDs and suicide bombers in crowded civilian areas claimed unprecedented numbers of casualties in government-held areas. In areas it controls, ISIL used extreme violence against civilians and captured fighters and plants landmines that injure and kill civilians. Other anti-government armed groups have shelled civilian neighborhoods. I go on, but the point is that in the Syrian war, the norms created last century to protect civilians are being systematically ignored by those doing the fighting. So it has fallen to the international community to respond. The UN, humanitarian organizations, bordering states, the United States. But when we see images every day of children dying, hospitals blown up, and convoys destroyed, I understand why the response seems completely inadequate and why there is such anguish, especially in the Syrian-American community, which has been doing its utmost to help since the beginning. And so the question today, what more can we do to prioritize the protection of civilians? First, in order to know what more we can do, we need to recognize what is already being done. The humanitarian crisis in Syria is growing because the war is continuing and, in fact, has intensified since the collapse of the ceasefire last spring. But between January and October of 2015, the UN reported that an average of 6 million people per month received food assistance. A total of 8.1 million were provided with adequate drinking water, and 1.5 million children and adolescents benefited from education and interventions. That's surely not enough, but it's also not nothing. I know that humanitarian actors, and especially Syrians, are making remarkable efforts to deliver assistance, and it is very important to recognize these and to learn from what is working. Second, I want to say for the record how important I believe it is that humanitarian action should be consistent with and reinforce established humanitarian principles. Humanitarian aid should be provided based on need and without discrimination wherever affected populations are found. At a time when humanitarian norms are being undermined all around us, it is so important to continue to be guided by the ideals of universality and impartiality. Third, as I noted at the beginning, we have to recognize the political reality that without a peace process of some kind, the Syrian conflict and the human rights and humanitarian crisis it feeds will continue. Humanitarian access, if achieved, is not a substitute for ending the conflict. The reality is that we must operate at 2 levels. We need to bring the war to an end, which is a diplomatic and political task, and for that reason we must continue diplomatic efforts. In the meantime, we also must make sure that we are doing all we can to respond to the humanitarian crisis and to provide civilian protection. I say this recognizing that the events of the last couple of days are a huge blow on both fronts. Fourth, I would encourage everyone to make sure that we are making the best possible use of the tools we already have in hand. For example, since 2011, President Obama has issued several executive orders that authorize imposing sanctions on Syrian officials responsible for human rights abuses. There is legislation pending in the House that I know many in the audience support that would reinforce many of these same sanctions. Even without that legislation, though, the U.S. government already has the authority to sanction Syrians engaged in human rights violations. In fact, the existing Syria sanctions program is one of the most comprehensive of the U.S. sanctions programs. It's worth asking whether more could be done with these authorities. Fifth, as I'm sure everyone is aware, there is an ongoing debate in Washington over the merits of establishing a safe zone as a way to improve protection for civilians in Syria. One of the many issues this idea raises is the question of enforcement. Protected areas or safe zones are either set up with the agreement of the parties to a conflict or they have to be imposed. If imposed, they have to be enforced or defended. In Syria, the persistent obstacles to humanitarian access suggest that the prospects for reaching agreement on a protected area are not good. That leaves the option of imposing a safe zone with or without a UN Security Council resolution. According to the Pentagon, this would require a military footprint of 15,000 to 30,000 troops. Now, I am personally not persuaded that imposing a safe zone is necessarily a good option, but Congress should debate this question. We ought to be talking about it. It's our job to authorize the use of military force, and we haven't been doing our job, quite frankly. While our military footprint grows in this conflict, Congress remains silent, and I find that unconscionable. People have different opinions on what to do, but we ought to debate them. And Congress has a constitutional responsibility when it comes to these matters. And I get it. These are tough issues, and there's no easy answers, and people don't want to be held accountable, but that's too bad. Don't run for Congress. So I encourage you to advocate for a full, informed congressional debate on the idea of safe zones and any other options that are on the table with regard to Syria. Finally, and I'm sure that I speak for all my colleagues, I cannot begin to express the sorrow and the anger and the frustration I feel as I watch the brutal and wanton murder of the Syrian people, whether by barrel bombs or by slow starvation. For the record, I must recognize and respect the incredible resilience of the Syrian people. It is mostly Syrians who are on the ground doing what they can to help people survive. As someone pointed out to me recently, those providing humanitarian assistance go in and out of the country. They could stay out, but they don't. As we think about what more we can do, I'm reminded that our contribution pales in comparison to theirs. So with that, I want to recognize our panel of witnesses, all of whom represent humanitarian organizations that are operating in Syria. They will discuss their efforts to provide humanitarian assistance inside the country, what they have achieved, the obstacles they face, and their recommendations. And so let me begin first to introduce Dr. Ahmad Tarakchi. I want to make sure. He's the president of the Syrian American Medical Society, a nonprofit professional and medical relief organization that represents thousands of Syrian American medical professionals in the United States and provides assistance to Syrians in need. Joel Charney is the director of the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, USA. Prior to joining NRC, USA in 2016, he was the vice president for humanitarian policy and practice at Interaction, where he was responsible for leading Interaction's work on humanitarian response, which involved engaging with the U.S. government, the United Nations, and member non-governmental organizations on both practical and policy matters. Richard Leach serves as the president and CEO of World Food Program USA, a nonprofit organization that seeks to shape U.S. public policy and generate resources to address global hunger. And I think we're going to be joined by a couple of other people, I think, who I think are running a little bit late. But we will. They'll be on our. I'm sorry, they'll be on our second panel. So I didn't realize. I thought everybody was going to be on one panel, but two panels. So having said that, let us Let us begin. Doctor, why don't we begin with you? Thank you all for being here.
Chairman McGovern, thank you for this great opportunity. On behalf of the Syrian American Medical Society and people inside Syria, we are thankful for organizing this important hearing. My name is Ahmad Torakji. I am the president of the Syrian American Medical Society, a cardiovascular surgeon from California and born and raised in Aleppo. The Syrian American Medical Society, believing in highest moral and humanitarian values, and with that, we have established over the last few years more than 120 hospitals and clinics inside Syria, with the principle of providing dignified medical care for people in need. Last year, we served more than 2.6 million patients inside Syria and in the neighboring countries. We did that through supporting more than 1,700 physicians and nurses. Our services extends between Syria, mainly, and the neighboring countries between Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Greece. Mr. Chairman, we continue to witness countless atrocities and blatant violations of human rights in Syria. As you mentioned, civilians and the civil infrastructures are targeted every single day. Chemical weapons are used against civilians ruthlessly. The siege tactic has been used as tactic of war, and people were starved to death. And as you mentioned, medical and food aid were denied to people in need. My hometown of Aleppo, over the last few months, have witnessed unprecedented violence against civilians. In the eastern part of the city right now, which is completely besieged, they have more than 300,000 people inside that part of town. 85,000 of them are children. They've been bombed, targeted, starved, and gassed to death. 2 weeks ago, in the neighborhood of Al-Sukkari, in the eastern part of the city, chlorine bombs were dropped on civilians, and that resulted in more than 150 casualties that were treated in our hospitals. The people inside Aleppo and the other parts of Syria believe that all of this action aims towards displacing them out of Syria, and that's punishment method used against civilians. As you know, last week also, convoys that were supposed to be heading towards Aleppo to help them out were struck by Air Force, again abandoning delivering medical aid and food to people in need. Over the last 4 years, we've documented more than 161 attacks using chemical weapons on the civilians inside Syria. That's towards the end of 2015, and those attacks continue. That's despite the UN Security Council resolution and other attempts to stop those chlorine attacks and chemical weapons attacks. In addition to that, we have witnessed constant targeting of civilians and physicians inside Syria. For SAMS alone, in 2015, we lost one physician every 2 weeks by attacks on healthcare facilities and on physicians outside of the healthcare facilities. That's for SAMS by itself. Since October, we witnessed increased and escalation of attacks on healthcare facilities to the point where in July, we witnessed one attack every 18 hours on a hospital in Syria. For SAMS by itself, in the month of August, we witnessed one attack on our hospitals every 2 days. That's unheard of. That's unacceptable. My colleague, my dear friend, Dr. Hassan Al-Araj from Hama, he was a cardiologist. He gave away his hospital and his family wealth to treat people for free in his town of Hama. To protect his patients, he suggested building a hospital in a cave in 21st century. We spent a year building that hospital in that cave in Hama to protect patients. A few weeks after we launched the medical operation in that hospital, the cave hospital, and as he was leaving the hospital riding his car, a missile struck his car and he passed away from that, leaving behind his family and his patients. The use of siege as a weapon of war has also been particularly deadly. Hundreds of deaths were reported and documented in many cities all over Syria, between Madaya, Muaddamiya, Daraya, Aleppo, Al-War, and other towns as well. Not only that, even children were denied medical evacuations for no explained reason until they suffered from death or suffer from permanent disability. Back in July, a few months ago, a conjoined twin, were born in the besieged eastern Ghouta. Our field hospital over there contacted us, and we reached out to the international community trying to evacuate them from eastern Ghouta to Damascus, a distance of less than 10 kilometers. It took 2 weeks to get them out from besieged Ghouta to Damascus hospital. They were not admitted to the specialized children's hospital in Damascus. They were denied admission, even with their complicated condition. And then when they were in Damascus, we start arranging for their evacuation to get treated in specialized centers in the United States. The civil society in the United States was very generous and supporting, and we drafted a plan to evacuate the kids from the Syrian borders all the way to the United States and get them pro bono treatment. This is what we believe in. For 2 weeks, their evacuation was denied. They were completely blocked off any communication with their families, with their doctors. Even I picked up the phone and called Damascus, asking for somebody who's humane and brave enough to say, yes, we will help you. I got no answer. At an age of 1 month old, both of them died. They could have been easily saved. They have nothing to do with any political conflict. That story continues on and on and on in Syria. In the city of Madaya, a few months before that, 3 boys, aged 6 and 7, were playing in their neighborhood. And they found a toy on the ground. They picked it up, and one of them found that this was a landmine. Horrified, he dropped it. An explosion happened, took the life of the first one. The other 2 were severely injured. They were evacuated to our hospital in Madaya. That's the only hospital that serves 40,000 people in the city of Madaya, where we've seen the starvation and people dying over there. For the next 24 hours, we begged the international community over and over and over, please evacuate them to any hospital in Damascus, less than 5 kilometers away. They could have just walked it if they were healthy. And after 24 hours, with no response, no intervention, nothing, they passed away. Yet for all humanitarian actors seeking to help improve the situation, there continues to be major obstacles to providing aid and relief to these besieged areas. The UN, for all of its efforts and good intentions, has been subjected to attempts by the Syrian government to determine the distribution of aid, even though there's a Security Council resolution and mandate which allows their agencies to operate without government consent. As you know, the convoys were stripped from necessary food and medical aid that's needed for people. The convoys were blocked from reaching their final destination, and recently they were struck and burned. The UN, with the backing of the broader international community, must retake control of aid distribution and use their full rights and powers as delegated by the Security Council to ensure a transparent, efficient operation. Mr. Chairman, in just the past few minutes, I've already relayed countless humanitarian rights violations that the people of Syria face every single day. They do not deserve this suffering. Nobody deserves this suffering. I would like to make the following recommendations. First, Congress should call on the administration to work with the Security Council to establish an independent third party to supervise and document aid distribution. Second, medical evacuation processes in Syria should be revised to establish new protocols in which the process of medical evacuations remains transparent, compliant with international humanitarian law, and is not subject to political negotiations or the influence of parties to the conflict. Third, Congress should pass a resolution calling on the UN government and the UN Security Council to refer perpetrators of chemical weapon attacks to the International Criminal Court. And lastly, given the systematic nature of the attacks on hospitals in Syria, we call for an independent investigation that's designed to identify and assign attribution for such hospital attacks. As you said, Mr. Chairman, this is a critical moment for action. Together, we can work to ensure a better future for the people of Syria. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leach.
Thank you for your leadership. You have provided invaluable leadership not only to this institution, but to the American people and for the world. And the international community is fortunate that you are here and serving. The World Food Program today is providing food assistance to approximately 4.2 million people within Syria. About 1 million of that 4.2 million people are in hard-to-reach and besieged areas. Another 1.6 million refugees in region are also being assisted by the World Food Program. But with all of that being said, there's still about 3.7 million people inside Syria that we are not reaching, that the international community, that the local humanitarian community is not reaching. Why? Not because of lack of resources. Actually, this operation is one of the only ones we can say has been fully resourced, the operation to help inside Syria and the region. We're not reaching them because we don't have access. We don't have access to people in need because of violence, because of harassment at checkpoints. In the paper today, there was a story again about a 55-truck convoy sitting at the Syrian-Turkey border. It's been there for 2 weeks. It has enough food on it to feed 185,000 people in eastern Aleppo. It's still sitting there. We've heard stories this morning that the food might rot by Monday. The implications of a lack of access are real, and they're tragic. We're hearing stories of people eating grass, of eating anything they could find. Obviously, this is not a healthy diet. It's tragic. People are suffering. We can't even tell you that we have cases that we have confirmed of malnutrition because we don't have access. When we do have access to some of these besieged areas, it's severely limited. We would have perhaps 6 hours, 10 hours to get in, to unload, to distribute aid, to unload the trucks. The journey to these besieged areas is long and arduous, even if it's a short distance, because of harassment at checkpoints. Arriving in towns oftentimes at night, towns where there's no electricity, no lights. I spoke with a relief worker yesterday. She told about a 55-truck convoy that was going to an area that had been besieged. They had not received food for over 18 months. It was a 9-mile journey from where the trucks left in Damascus to get to this area. It took 37 hours to go 9 miles. When they arrived in the dark of night, they explained that it was almost eerily quiet. And slowly they saw people come from darkened rubble that were homes where people lived. But even with the availability of food, it was still quiet. There was no expressions of anything close to happiness or joy because people were so hungry they did not have the energy. When the drivers finished unloading the vehicles and getting back in the trucks ready to leave, they told of mothers who came and tried to hand them their children, their babies, to take them out of the area. What is needed is immediate, unconditional access for all humanitarian workers in all areas for all people. A lifting of the sieges, an ability to move through checkpoints unharassed, and a commitment to ensure the protection of relief workers. In the bombing of the trucks that were just mentioned, 20 volunteers were killed, relief workers. We have the logistical network in place to serve all people in need. We just need to have those with guns to allow us to do it. People are losing hope. They're more desperate than ever. They don't understand why the war is raging around them, why they're being punished. But with the delivery of food, we bring some sense of hope. We create a sense, a small sense that the world is not forgotten, that we actually care about what is happening. We can't relent. We have to continue the efforts that you're pursuing, that others are pursuing, to make certain that humanitarian support is available to all people in all areas. So yesterday I spoke to someone in Syria and I said, what message should I deliver today to you? And they said the people inside Syria know who's supporting them. They know who's there. And they know that the American people and the American government is there and supporting them. I don't want to in any way downplay the tragic situation in Syria, but it's also important to note that right now, today, there are wars raging across the globe. We have, as you mentioned, more people displaced today because of war than any time in recorded history, 65.8 million people, more than World War II. And we know there's conflicts, whether it be South Sudan, Central African Republic, Yemen, Burundi, and we know that the average length of time that people are displaced today is 17 to 20 years. And we also know that the return to home of refugees, of those displaced, is at a 30-year low. And most of the refugees are not living in the United States or Europe. They're living in middle-income and developing countries, countries that don't even have the capacity oftentimes to provide for their own people, who are now also put in a situation where they have to and are willingly oftentimes providing for those refugees. Ethiopia has 700,000 refugees. Kenya, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Somalia. 25% of the population of Lebanon are Syrian refugees. So last year, the international community issued an appeal to say, to meet the most basic needs, food, shelter, water, for people displaced, it'll cost the international community $20 billion. Of that $20 billion, 55% was funded. So when you talk to a family in Beirut who says that the UN has now, the World Food Program, cut back aid by 50% because we ran out of resources, the notion of getting on a rubber dinghy and looking for Europe becomes a viable option. I mean, what would you do to ensure that your child had a capacity to eat? There's real implications of our inability to fully fund these appeals. So this year, 2016, the appeal, approximately $21 billion. As of the end of last month, it was 35% met. So what's it mean for us, the World Food Program? We just recently cut back aid in Uganda to refugees from South Sudan. In October, we will likely have to cut back aid in Tanzania for refugees escaping from violence in Burundi. While the overall generosity of the international community has been going up, the gap between need and resources is growing. But we know what to do. We know what can be done to address these crises. And in fact, there's general consensus around three general categories of activity. First, we just need to ensure that we fund these appeals. And shouldn't all come from the United States, but the President of the United States needs to ensure that all countries provide their share to make certain that that $20 billion is fully funded. It is inexcusable, as we sit here today, that there is a gap in funding for these most basic needs. It's not surprising that we saw refugee flows into Europe. Second, we need to provide support to those frontline nations that are hosting refugees. They're doing a public good for the world, and it needs to be acknowledged. And finally, we need to look within our own government, our own relief operations, our own development operations, and to determine how to more effectively integrate emergency need and longer-term development. It is no longer acceptable, and it never has been, to have two separate boxes that don't adequately integrate. We need to look at our operations and make the requisite changes. So let me close on 3 points. One, on Syria, we must demand immediate and unfettered access for humanitarian assistance to all people and all territories, and we need to make that demand every single day until it is fully met. On the overall effort to address the humanitarian response system to increase its efficiency, if we take these steps, It will not only be a challenge, but an opportunity to create more stability around the world, serve our own security interests as well. And finally, we will not achieve any of these objectives without strong U.S. leadership at the highest levels. Thank you very much for allowing us to testify today.
Mr. Charney, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think I personally and NRC, we appreciate the leadership that you show and that Congressman Pitt shows in terms of precisely organizing regular open debates on important global human rights and humanitarian challenges. And that's very welcome, whether it's Syria or Bahrain or whatever. The role that you play is really vital. You know, my colleagues have described the situation in Syria, and I think everyone in this room knows how grim it is. I think I can say for NRC, I'm not sure we've ever faced such a challenging environment in which to respond, with all parties to the conflict attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure ruthlessly and with no remorse. How do we work there? I think NRC, through just very patient negotiation and partnership with Syrian organizations, is one of the only NGOs that's responding to the crisis using all means. We work in Damascus and work in areas controlled by the government. We do cross-line out of Damascus to areas that the government does not control, and we also implement cross-border programs. We've reached about 1 million people in the past 2 years with education, shelter, water and sanitation, food security, livelihoods, and emergency response. And we're using cash increasingly as a way to give vulnerable Syrians the flexibility and the income that they need to make their own choices about how to allocate the resources that we have. As I mentioned, we implement a portion of our programs with NRC staff, but most of our assistance is implemented through partnerships with Syrian organizations. Working with our Syrian humanitarian partners has enabled NRC to achieve principled access in this very insecure operating environment, while also contributing to building local humanitarian response capacity. So what can we do? As you may know, our Secretary General, Jan Egeland, based in Oslo, also serves as co-chair of the Humanitarian Task Force of the International Support Group for Syria, and as a humanitarian advisor to the UN mediation effort. And I know how passionate Jan is about wanting to make diplomacy work. And he basically said, look, my message is, when the US and Russia have been willing and able to provide joint leadership, there has been progress in humanitarian access to the 18 besieged areas in Syria, and progress in protection of civilians through cessations of hostilities. But when there's been no such effective leadership, external powers have been free to bring fuel to the fire in Syria, and the civilian population has ended up in a free fall. It's a very discouraging moment, obviously, with the breakdown in the ceasefire and the recent attack on the UN and Syrian Arab Red Crescent convoy to Big Orem in Aleppo, as well as new attacks on hospitals, as we've heard already. Without assurances from international and local parties that they will respect clearly marked and announced humanitarian convoys and installations, the whole cross-frontline lifeline to millions of Syrians is threatened. The need for U.S. diplomatic and humanitarian leadership, including in engaging with Russia and all regional powers, is a question of life or death for our humanitarian efforts in Syria. Now, in my written testimony, I put forward 6 measures to enhance protection of civilians. And I'll be honest with you, after what we've heard, what we've lived, I've been to Syria, I've seen it. It doesn't sound like much, but there are perhaps some measures that we can take that can be implemented that at least would make a difference at the margins, absent the overall kind of political solution, or at least an agreement around ceasefires and protection of our work that we need. The first is access to documentation. The best way to increase people's freedom of movement and access to humanitarian assistance across the country is to strengthen systems which allow persons entitled to Syrian civil documentation to access them or temporary alternatives. The lack of documentation should not prevent people from exercising their right to travel or leave Syria. Furthermore, civil documentation and the ability to prove one's legal identity are paramount to protection and provide the framework for freedom of movement and the enjoyment of other rights such as education, healthcare, housing, land, and property. And our belief is, at some level, all parties to the conflict should want Syrians to be able to prove that they're Syrian, prove that their identity, and be able to access key services. And we feel like more effort could be done in this regard, and again, perhaps make a small difference in allowing people to access assistance. The second is demining. First-line access for demining agencies should be a priority. All parties to the conflict must allow clearance of explosive remnants of war and ensure the respect and safety for humanitarian staff conducting clearance activities in Syria. With fighting raging in many parts of the country, fleeing civilians are at risk as areas they are moving towards are often contaminated. Humanitarian mine action organizations should be engaged and facilitated to operate both cross-border and cross-line from Damascus. Just a month ago, after the Syrian Defense Force seized control of Manbij in northern Syria from ISIS, many civilians spontaneously returned to their homes. 126 people were reported to have been killed in the first wave of returns, and more than 80 injured, including 16 women and 26 children, due to explosives that were remaining in the town, contaminating it. The third is access to asylum. I think we're all familiar with that imperative. Neighboring countries, like Jordan and Lebanon in particular, but also Turkey, are feeling more and more overwhelmed. But we have to maintain that right to asylum to the extent possible, support those countries, given the burden that they're taking on. Neither the establishment of camps inside Syria nor the provision of cross-border assistance can justify governments closing their borders to Syrians fleeing violence and seeking asylum. And then finally, and this I think is the most utopian of the four that I've mentioned, guaranteeing protection to humanitarian aid workers. And again, how do you do that in a situation of total impunity? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. But attacks on aid, and I think they'll get into this, I assume, in the second panel, but attacks on aid workers have to be met by full accountability measures to ensure that precedents are not created that shrink our space, not only in Syria, but elsewhere. My written testimony has a discussion of safe zones. Please have that debate. I mean, it's been very much on the margins, I think, both in the Senate and the House. And yes, let's talk about it, but let's have a realistic discussion about what would really be involved. Our core feeling as humanitarians, and not only experience in Syria, but in other locations, is that the safe zones won't be safe. Yet, I and we totally understand the desperation that people are feeling and are no doubt thinking, if hearing this list, well, how is that fundamentally going to protect Aleppo? So having that debate and really looking at what the implications are, I think that personally I strongly believe in the importance of that. But I think as a practical matter, ensuring the safety of Syrians through safe zones would probably fail, and ultimately we're stuck in this trap that we've been in, where it's about diplomacy, it's about bringing people to the table, and finally reaching an agreement that will protect the people of Syria. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for your testimony, and and it's kind of difficult to figure out what to ask in the aftermath of what all that you have said. I mean, I agree with almost all the recommendations that have been put forward, and but we always run up against kind of the same problem, and that is that you know, we know what we would do in a perfect world, and we want to hold people accountable for terrible things, and obviously we, you know, gathering evidence and, you know, International Criminal Court and independent commissions to, you know, document all the terrible atrocities, but that has to happen because there has to be a consequence to all of this terrible carnage that's going on. But then we get back to the immediate, where that's not necessarily going to open the opportunity to get more humanitarian assistance to people right now who desperately need it. You know, let me just, I mean, this is some of the stuff you hear. I hear from constituents, and we hear from some members of Congress, and any of you or all of you can react to it. Some people say, well, you know, in area, you know, when you can't deliver convoys, when convoys can't get to places, when you don't have easy access, then you should fly over the areas you can't get to, and you know, and do airdrops of food, which I know sounds easier said than done, and it presents its own set of dangers and complications. But I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Well, the World Food Program. The World Food Program is involved in airlifts and airdrops at this stage, but in terms of meeting the scale of the need in the environment, it's a limited tool. But the World Food Program is in fact involved in some airdrops in areas that ISIS controls, where we would not have access otherwise.
I want to congratulate my colleagues also and show some disagreement, with all respect. I think the issue at stake over here is the humanitarian values that we have to protect. We have to strengthen and empower our humanitarian values and not leave it subject to political negotiations. And this is what's at stake right now. We are not charity. If you're doing charity, you can take a food box and give it to whoever is available. Humanitarian operation, by principle, is a transparent, goal-oriented, independent operation. And that's very strong, and it has teeth, and that it can defend itself, and stronger than politicians. We are not behind the politicians. We are at the forefront. We have to take responsibilities as humanitarians of delivering that strong message. Politicians have to do their own part of negotiation, establishing peace, ending war, and so on. As a humanitarian, we have to take the responsibility and be at the forefront of holding people accountable for their violations. Physicians are risking their lives. Humanitarian aid people are risking their lives. But people going inside Syria, leaving California, Chicago, New York, to go inside Syria, to do medical missions, to educate people. They take that risk. They do the same thing from Europe. They live wealthy life, but they leave all that behind and they go inside. We cannot sit behind and wait for the politicians to give us that peace. We are not charity. Talking about airdrops, and I'm just coming back to your point, is actually, again, with all respect that we have, and I know we all have this agreement on that, is not at the level where it needs to be. When I have my children in Madaya starved to death, well, airdrops has to be started. It's not going to be efficient. I don't expect to feed 40,000 people of the city of Madaya, but at least I can save the life of 1 or 2 children who are dying to death. And it breaks my heart that we see even the airdrops are also influenced by the politicians. Yes, I would want airdrops all over Syria. I want it to every single child, to every single woman, to every single adult. But then we were seeing those children dying there in front of us. They need an antibiotic, they need surgical equipment, they need food. Then it is my time to go in and drop in something, at least 1 box. As a matter of fact, and I take pride of this, that the Syrian American community and the other diaspora-led organizations organized very sophisticated humanitarian networks on the ground, that even when the convoys were allowed inside Madaya, when people were starved to death and they're still starving, we have not witnessed any conflict on the distribution of those trucks. We have not seen anything reported. They stayed in line, they waited for their boxes, the hospitals and the local council over there arrange a list of people of most need. So the first truck that got in after a few days of delay was distributed to the most need, and so on. Again, this is a humanitarian operation. It's not charity. We have not seen any of that happening anywhere else. And unfortunately, we are, again, and I'm sorry for being probably out of line over here, but we cannot wait for politicians to tell us what we need to do. We have value that we have to deliver, and we have to go to the front line to deliver our humanitarian values. And with all love and respect for my colleagues in the humanitarian operation, we failed in Syria. We did fail in Syria. Thank you.
No, and look, I appreciate what you just said. I think and to the extent that you've been able to get around the politicians and government restrictions and all the other aspects of this conflict, you know, and have been able to be successful, we ought to figure out how we can build on that and do more. But then you're presented with the issue, I think Mr. Leach brought up at the beginning, that the UN World Food Program has a bunch of food that is at the border, right? You know, that can't get to the people who need it. How do you, how do you, and the food may rot by Monday. How do you get around that? And you know, we all are dedicated to humanitarian principles, but in practical terms, you know, what should they be doing? What could they do that they're not doing? Knowing that, you know, they're not a military force; they're a humanitarian organization.
I think there are people, actually, humanitarian people in the United States, in Europe, and all over the world who are ready to jump on those trucks and drive them and willing to get subjected to whatever happens in those checkpoints. So if that's an option, I can tell you that convoys can be delivered. I can line hundreds of people who can jump on those trucks and drive them and deliver them to the final destination and oversee the distribution. But that should be expressed by the international agencies that, yes, we want to do that, and people will take their own risk, and people will do it.
Can you talk about how the challenges and are different from when you deal with areas that are under government control versus opposition control versus how do you all operate under those complicated situations?
Well, I think you know, out of Damascus, there's obviously very tight political control by the central government, and it's a matter of, you know, negotiating space, identifying communities that are vulnerable, identifying Syrian partners that are working in those areas, and then through a painstaking and sometimes short, sometimes lengthy process of negotiation, getting the agreement to go ahead. Again, we have been able, and I think maybe my comment about political actors was somewhat misunderstood, because precisely what we're doing, I hope, is what you're describing, which is driving a humanitarian agenda in the face of tremendous obstacles. I think the cross-border work is, I want to say, freer in the sense that you don't have this load of the government controlling our every move, and, you know, maybe attempting, you know, putting up obstacles to where we might want to work that we have to push back against. I think the primary obstacle from a cross-border standpoint is security and an ability to assure that through Syrian partners, that assistance is going to the most vulnerable people. So I mean, there's just the careful process is less about permission, although it can be depending on the area in terms of negotiating with armed actors, but it's more about just assuring that there's a coherence to the program, that the program itself meets humanitarian standards, and then being able to liaise closely with the Syrian groups that are carrying out the assistance.
A very similar approach in that on the ground working with literally hundreds of different local organizations and those within the areas that WFP is getting into who do the local distribution in a very similar way that was just described. The bottom line is it's difficult no matter who you're working with. And on the ground, people are working with governments, people are working in the opposition-held areas, and in all areas it's difficult, and in all areas it's negotiated capacity to get in and provide as much assistance as can be provided. To say it's the most challenging environment I think we've operated in is an accurate statement.
Doctor.
I probably look at that the same way my colleagues look at it. But there's the other concern also that we all have as international agencies, where we always try to overlook the transparency of the operation through those three hubs that are mentioned. The one that's cross-line, that's within Syria, but going from government to the ungovernment-controlled area, the one that's cross-border, coming from the neighboring countries, and the one that's operated within the government-controlled area. And we all agree that every single person in Syria need to have some aid and support, regardless of anything else. The concern that has been raised up over year after year is, are our humanitarian aids being manipulated in a way that the Syrian government is allowing more aid to go towards people to buy their loyalty? And I know we've seen this in previous wars as well. And it will be great if the international community and the United States and other countries take leadership in overlooking this operation. And we know it's very complicated. It's beyond an NGO or one entity. But then that transparency has to be overlooked and supported as we want to empower every humanitarian operation inside Syria. There are lots of heated debate going on right now in the region about cross-border and cross-line, referring to the convoy that was hit in Aleppo in Orem al-Kubra last week.
Right.
It's very difficult to understand why those convoys were not sent cross-border, as we have an established transparent operation to eastern Aleppo, why those convoys did not go cross-border, and they were sent as cross-line operation, and as exactly what we have seen. They've been uploaded in Orem Kubra, and they were struck. Now, talking about efficiency and distribution, this is a complete different issue. But again, why are we trying to go around and try to navigate our humanitarian operation? And again, establishing the transparency and efficiency of medical and humanitarian relief is very important at this stage to allow less manipulation and to hold accountability. I am accountable for my donors in the United States for every single dollar that they give me. We go inside Syria, our leadership of SAMS go inside Syria every single month to make sure that the medical care is delivered free of charge to everybody. Where's the rest? And I know it's a very complicated process, but then some leadership has to be established. And again, this is beyond politics, where we need to see the, as you said, the United States, Europe, and others taking a close look on where the money is going and how it's being processed.
On the political issue, I think we all need to do everything we're doing within country. There is no question. But there needs to be, as you're suggesting, as you're making a reality, unrelenting political pressure on all players who are involved and to all those who could influence the players involved. It needs to operate at both ends. We are not going to solve this as a humanitarian operation. There needs to be accountability and political pressure and continued unrelenting. Our Secretary of State's been on the forefront. We need to continue that and do more, and we can't relent. There can't be a day when we're not pushing this agenda, because we're going to do everything, all the organizations represented here and hundreds of others and incredibly courageous people in country. But until we get access to all parts of the country, until the big picture, the war stops, we're going to continue trying to plug holes in the dam. And the implications are the people being mentioned, right. The children who represent well more than 50% of those who are victims.
But building on Dr. Tarakji's comment, I do think truly from a humanitarian perspective and sort of an inside agency perspective, I think we could do better at assessing where the needs really are and determining who is in a best position to respond to those needs. And that was, I don't want to get into arcane, UN and interagency politics, but I mean, that was the intention of what's called the whole of Syria approach. And trying to reconcile cross-border, cross-line inside Damascus, and again, see who's best positioned to provide aid there. I do feel like there's still a bit of work that can be done to make sure that I don't mean efficient, like scientifically efficient, I mean, how can we reach the most vulnerable people in the best possible way? I think there's work that could be done internally within the humanitarian community to improve that. That's not, in fact, dependent on the political actors.
And that actually makes sense, because everybody has their all different strengths, right? And your strength may be here, but not as strong over here, so that coordination.
No, that's it, and the difficulty is it's such a huge operation, and B, I'm afraid to say there are some political divisions within the operation that make it difficult to get everyone on the same page.
Mr. Leach mentioned in his testimony about the shortfall in humanitarian funding at the global level, which is a serious issue. I mean, I'm someone who believes that food ought to be a fundamental right for everybody. I mean, and there's no reason in this world why anybody should not have access to food. But the U.S. is currently the largest single donor to the humanitarian response plan for Syria. And I guess my question is, is the U.S. doing enough in that regard? I mean, I think you mentioned that the issue is not so much the resources, it's access and security. I may be paraphrasing, but I mean, should we be doing more? When we hear stories that there's enough food, the convoys that are at the border could feed how many people? 185,000 people that might rot. Then you start to ask the question, are those resources that are there rotting, taking away from another emergency situation in some other part of the world? And how do we handle all of this?
Well, and thank you. A few things. One, for this year, the operation in Syria and the region has been fully funded. That's not true for next year yet. So even looking at Syria and the region, we still need to look at post-December and what we're going to do in the year ahead. We can't say in past it's been fully funded. The Syria operation today is. When I was referring to globally, looking at the needs via the emergency appeals that were issued and the amount of funding against those appeals, to me it is an obscenity that the world has not fully funded the immediate emergency appeals that the world has put forth. $20 billion to the world to meet the most basic needs of refugees and those displaced because of war. Right now, there is a lot of attention, and without alluding to the political pressures that the flow of refugees has caused in parts of the world, if we saw the same pressure from those escaping violence in South Sudan, maybe there'd be more focus. In Burundi, Central African Republic, Yemen, what's happening in Yemen is not on the front page of the paper either, but it's a horrific tragedy. The world has to fully fund this global appeal. It is just inexcusable. So yes, the United States government, in terms of funding, we have been a leader in funding the global effort. What I think the United States can do more of is advocate among other nations and not relent until every country participates and ensures that that $20 billion is fully funded at the beginning of the year. So I think as we look globally, and yes, for WFP, resources will be addressing that which our donor nations are telling us they must address. And that oftentimes means, as I was suggesting earlier, South Sudanese refugees in Uganda are not being adequately supported. And Uganda is one of a rare country that actually has fully embraced refugees coming in, provides legal access to land, and it fully integrates them into the system. So I think, and it would be interesting to talk about ways that we might even increase our appropriations. We've been generous. Needs are growing.
Right. But I think, is everyone agree? I mean, the issue with regard to kind of humanitarian assistance to Syria, it's not an issue now of resources, it's an issue of access and security. Is that, am I?
Yes.
Okay.
No, really, I don't think we can play the resource card. I mean, in an ideal world, sure, there's always need for more money, but I mean, fundamentally, that's not the issue.
Doctor?
I just want to add the issue of the efficiency and goals. As Mr. Leach mentioned earlier, that we have to integrate the emergency response with the midterm development plans. And we're trying to see, in addition to funding, what are we trying to achieve? If the priority, for example, is to vaccinate all the children of Syria, then we have to see if we are able to achieve that with $1 million or $100 million. And those goals have to be established as priorities, as Mr. Leach said, and after the food is being provided, and see what are we trying to do and how far are we going with the resources that we have.
Right. And
Add to that point, I mean, that's a critical vantage point to look at, because we are now, I mean, the other tragedy, Jan Eglin, a brilliant guy, drew out this diagram. He said, here's the period of war. And there's a long period leading up to a war, and then there's this generations after the war. That's the implications. Mm-hmm. We are going to see a generation of children from Syria who've not been educated. So we have to look at these longer-term implications, and that's part of merging this and thinking about not just short-term emergency, but long-term implications. Vaccinating kids. We're trying to figure out how, without support to the regime, to ensure that we're building some capacity, some livelihood capacity for post-war, because we're not, we have to keep focused. Hopefully when the guns are silenced, which will hopefully be sooner than later, the commitment's going to have to maintain.
Right. So we have to go to the next panel, but I'm going to give you all a chance to say whatever you want to say before we go on. But I want to go on a little rant for just shortly, because I can, right? Because I'm sitting here. You know, I was a year ago, July. I went to Gaziantep, and Senator Kaine of Virginia was with me, and a few other colleagues, and we're talking right now mostly about getting humanitarian aid to people who are in Syria, but then there's the whole issue of all those who have fled, what I wasn't prepared for was the enormity of the challenge. The refugee camps are filled, and then there's this whole issue of people who are not in refugee camps, who are just kind of living there, and it goes to your issue, Mr. Leach, about, we hear it over and over and over, that a lot of these kids don't have any place to go to school, and so there's a whole generation developing of kids who won't have any education, and then the whole, you know, the trauma that these kids have gone through, and the adults, but the kids, we met with some kids who were just looking off into space. These are kids who have been barrel bombed, they've seen their friends killed. I mean, we saw photos of a barrel bomb that was unexploded that fell and crushed a little child, and I mean, but to see this at any age is traumatic, and then and the numbers keep on growing, and then the patience of countries that are absorbing some of these refugees is getting to the point where I think politically it's being very difficult to sustain this. And we come back to here in the United States, where I will be honest with you, I think we have not done anywhere near what we have done. And when people say to me, well, why don't the other countries in the world do more? Well, they are. Compared to us, they're doing much, much, much more. And we have communities. I have communities in my district in Worcester, that strong Syrian communities that, are willing to welcome people, to help help provide people a new life, and we're still stuck in this crazy debate about vetting and about all kinds of issues that have nothing to do with the fact that a lot of the people most of the people we're talking about are people who had a decent life, and who are just put in a situation that if any of us were put in that situation, we would get the hell out of there with our families. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so there's that issue too, is that, we have an obligation on that end as well that we're not living up to. And so I think, the issue of how we better coordinate humanitarian agencies so that the group that is best equipped to get the assistance to whatever group it is, I think that's a good, something we got to figure out how to, it's easier said than done, right? The resources are there, at least for Syria. But this humanitarian concern is not just the people there, but also the people who have left. Just say one final thing. A number of the people we talked to said to us that all they want is an end to the bombing. That, that Syrian civil society cannot function when people are hiding underground, when schools are being bombed, when hospitals are being bombed. We can't develop our future, when all this is going on. So all of you have to stop bombing. The government, the U.S., Russia, everybody, no more bombing, because there needs to be some breathing space to be able to formulate civil society. And one of the things I worry about, and then this is my end of my rant, is that when you hear about this, about the Syrian conflict in the news, more often than not, it's talked about in terms of the U.S. and Russia. And I think it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, it's not Russia or the United States that needs to determine Syria's future. It's people who live in Syria. And so that's, sometimes gets lost here, that I think the people of Syria, if we're given the opportunity, will map out their future and, elect who they want to elect and, have the institutions they want to have. But, the fact that so much of this is dependent on the U.S. and Russia, sometimes I think minimizes the importance of the Syrians in this, all to say. So the Syrians who are going in there and delivering the humanitarian aid, the Syrians who are risking their lives, the Syrians who continue to stay there, I think that's, we need to find ways to be more supportive. So anyway, that's it. So anybody has any last things to say? I'll begin with you.
I mean, this is an issue that I haven't raised up until now, rather than re-emphasizing. I think the most powerful thing I heard when I was in Gaziantep and Antakya in June of 2015 was Syrians basically saying, in addition to stopping the bombing, saying, which I thought was very courageous, in essence, we want to rebuild, we're tired of handouts. And that's another whole challenge, I think, within the framework of the aid effort. Syrians just feeling like we cannot go on year after year after year just on the receiving end of humanitarian assistance. We want to rebuild the water system, knowing that it might be bombed. We want to rebuild the hospital, knowing that it might be attacked. And that's very challenging for donors because of those risks. But I think the strong desire of the Syrian people, even now in the midst of the war, to build something is I think, a sentiment that we need to encourage if we can.
Syria has, in many respects, put the human face of this humanitarian tragedy, global humanitarian tragedy, on the front page of the paper. I think us coming together to address this global humanitarian crisis is an opportunity to bring people and nations together. It's an opportunity and not just a challenge. And I think with U.S. leadership, we can actually address and surmount that challenge. We need things to bring this world together, all coming together to ensure that no child suffers like the children we've seen on the front page of the paper can be that opportunity.
Doctor?
I just came back from New York last night, and I was able to read the transcript from Secretary Kerry during the UN Security Council meeting. I think one of the very bright statements that he made when he referred to grounding of the Air Force and de-escalating the conflict inside Syria. I think this is probably a very needed first step, and certainly I encourage him and congratulate him on taking that step, and certainly will be very interesting for people inside Syria and the civil society to see if that can be practiced inside Syria, I think that would be a very good first step to protect the civil society and the humanitarian operation inside Syria, and hopefully more steps to follow. So well, probably all of us should be reach out to Secretary Kerry and see his plan and where those statements are going, and have follow up on that as well.
I'm going to see him on Monday.
Well, please
So
congratulate him
I
on
will
that
pass
statement.
on your views, but thank you very much. And look, I think the other thing we all ought to do is that when this crazy election is over with, that we need to get back to getting this institution of Congress to actually have a debate on this issue, that's thorough and comprehensive, because I think throughout all this, we're just kind of dangling here and not being engaged. And I don't know if you saw this, but on the White House webpage, they posted a video of a 6-year-old American boy. Did you see that? About who wrote a letter basically saying that the young boy who we all saw on the front pages of the newspaper, who after a bombing, whose face was bloody, that he could come and live with him and his sister, and he, you know what? I think that gives me hope, because to me that is when I think of our country, that's what I want to think of. I want to think that that people have the humanitarian center, if you will, that 6-year-old boy did. Unfortunately, I wish that 6-year-old boy were in Congress. He'd be talking about these issues more eloquently and persuasively than a lot of us are. But in any event, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your testimony and look forward to working with you. And now we're going to go to our next panel. Sarah Holwinski is a senior fellow at the Center for Renew American Security, focusing on responsible use of force in armed conflict and U.S. policy, and she's on the Board of Advisors of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Naomi Kiekoler, I hope I pronounced that correctly, did I? Is the Deputy Director of the Simon Scott, how do I want to make sure SKJODT Center for the Prevention of Genocide. For 6 years, she's developed and implemented the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect Work on Populations at Risk and efforts to advance R2P globally, and led the center's advocacy, including targeting the UN Security Council. And Chris Engels is a U.S. lawyer who currently serves as Deputy Director for Investigations and Operations for the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, in which role he oversees the organization's criminal investigations in Syria and Iraq. And we welcome you here. Ms. Holwinski, why don't you begin?
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thanks to the Lantos Human Rights Commission, and thank you, sir, for having us today to talk about this, and particularly for believing that despite the fact that we are not close to the end of the Syrian conflict or a solution, apparently, that civilians themselves may have solutions to keep themselves safe, which is what I will be talking about today. And I really appreciate you hosting this.
Thank you.
I love Massachusetts in the autumn, and I'm even happier to go back.
Come and
out
visit.
this year. Let me start by admitting that I think those of us who have worked on war for a long time, and particularly with all of these horrible statistics that are coming at us, tend to default to thinking about civilians as a monolithic group of inert and helpless victims. And I fall into that myself, and I think we need to remember today, and we've heard these stories, that civilians are actually, who are caught up in the conflict, are individuals, and they have inherent agency and dignity all their own. So for as much as the international community has abandoned them, Syrian civilians are helping each other survive. So today, I want to talk about something that we don't hear very much about, which is 3 strategies that civilians have come up with themselves in Syria to protect themselves. One is early warning systems for attacks coming from the air. The second is schools and hospitals being built underground or away from the front lines and bombs. And the third is creating local rescue teams. So we've heard a lot about the white helmets, but there are many, many more who are trying to keep people away from mines and acting as emergency medical personnel. Most of my analysis comes from CIVIC, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, which is a group solely dedicated to civilian protection and figuring out solutions to keep civilians safe. They recently went to Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria and talked with civilians themselves about how they keep themselves safe. I encourage everyone here actually to read the report because it's one of those unique reports nowadays where it's talking not about Syrians dying, but about Syrians helping each other live. So the first strategy, early warning systems. This seems very obvious, but of course, if we were to hear a siren go off and we knew that a bomb was coming toward us, we would shelter in the lowest place we could in the building, or we would hide behind some sort of object. It's the exact same thing for Syrian civilians. A man from Idlib said, "Most of the time, we just use our ears. If you are under the barrels, you do not hear it because of the buzz, but from further away, you can hear. The sound is the same for a dropping barrel bomb and the MiG coming down. If you hear the sound, it is far from you. If you do not, it is about to fall on you." So ears obviously aren't enough. And what Syrians have begun doing is creating spotter networks, which are made up of people all across the country who watch the skies day and night and then broadcast warnings of these military attacks on walkie-talkies, very expensive, but they've been getting them. Facebook groups, phone apps. Sometimes these spotters even eavesdrop on Syrian and Russian communications about when the bombs are going to be coming in and then have to scramble to find somebody who speaks Russian so they can actually understand it. Local radio stations have been set up to warn about attacks, and Syrian journalists as well. And so these local radio stations and Syrian journalists, taking great risk to themselves, are trying to warn each other in their neighborhoods about bombs, but also trying to tell us and the rest of the world, minute by minute, what's happening on the ground. Information like this can provide mere seconds to real minutes for Syrians to take cover, and every moment is precious. I was speaking this morning with the head of an early warning system in Idlib, who, once he set up the system some months ago, got a call within 24 hours from a Syrian man who said, "You saved my family's life by setting up this early warning system." And as you noted from your trip to Gaziantep, it's not just about saving literal lives, it's the trauma. So many people who are going to need to rebuild their nation are traumatized by living in constant fear of death coming from the skies. And the early warning system gives them just a slight moment of calm, which is a blessing. They can go farm their fields, they can visit relatives, and they can live in their communities instead of constantly looking up. The second strategy, which Dr. Tarachi talked about, was schools and hospitals being built in a relatively safe place. So for the structures that are already there, the schools and hospitals, they've been creating air raid huts nearby. They have been using the basements as operating theaters. These are all very innovative things that can keep civilians safe. One of the biggest things for hospitals is to create smaller clinics. So I sort of think of them as clinical huts around conflict zones. There was one man who was shot, he's from Homs, he was shot by Syrian soldiers in the back and endured 21 hours of trying to get through checkpoints just to get care. So you think about being in this conflict zone and trying to get to a major hospital, it's just not going to work. So these smaller medical huts can mean the difference between somebody actually maybe seeing a doctor and it being entirely unfeasible for them to do so. And third, the third civilian protection strategy, Syrians know that nobody right now is coming to rescue them, so they have banded together to rescue each other. And they do that through local defense forces, through local rescue forces. We all know about the White Helmets, the Syrian Civil Defense. They've been, I think, rightly nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize this year. They sift through rubble to find civilians. They take injured civilians from dangerous areas. They dispose of exploded ordnance and mines. As one Syrian civilian told Civic, "The Russian airstrikes are targeting the town of Sama like crazy with everything. The Syrian defense, the White Helmets, help a lot. At 3 a.m, they came right away to help the wounded. They're ready 24 hours a day. If they hear any news from walkie-talkies, they come directly to rescue people." I think the Syrians and so many of us here in this room believe that the White Helmets are heroes, but there are also so many other local groups that are firefighting, using triage to save people's lives, removing rubble, and keeping people away from mines. And it's clear that these groups take huge risks to do what they're doing. 100 white helmets at least have been killed, and yet at the end of 2015, they had saved 40,000 people. So if you're thinking about a return on investment, that's about as best you can do. That's pretty phenomenal. And I think that it further puts shame on all of the nations voicing concern for Syrian civilians who have done so little to help as Syrians are trying to help each other. So as I make my recommendations, let's just keep in mind that the United Nations Security Council has adopted 7 UN resolutions related to Syrian government's treatment of its own people. And yet, every single day, we see that Syrian and Russian planes are bombing civilians on purpose. They are bombing schools and hospitals on purpose. They are stopping aid from entering populated cities. And they're basically making Syria inaccessible for so many of us who would want to help. So, unless the international community is willing to protect civilians against these attacks from Russia and Syria, it's time to consider, at the very least, surging support to these Syrians themselves who are already bravely protecting their families and neighbors. The U.S. could make a big difference with this money. Now, the United States is already the biggest donor to humanitarian aid in Syria, but the strategies that I just laid out are no-brainers. These are, and I could go on forever on details on what this would actually look like on the ground. I don't think I need to, because it is so obvious that supporting early warning systems to make sure that they have the technology and the advanced support to actually help them understand where the bomb's going to drop and to give them even 30 seconds more to find shelter would be so remarkable for civilians. Ensuring that funding goes to building these underground shelters or giving support, including where can they find the lumber, where can they find the scrap metal, giving that kind of support to build these structures would be remarkable. And of course, giving more support to local responders and civic groups like the White Helmets, but not only the White Helmets. We've been supporting them, but there are so many other local groups that fall into that category. Money like that can't just be thrown at civilians sort of willy-nilly, ad hoc, and protection will just appear. The United States needs to have a strategy for this. Start with state, start with AID, and all of their NGO partners. They know how to do this. They have the expertise. And in particular, it's the civilians themselves who need to be directing us as to what they want, what works for them. They've been through this for 5 years. They actually have effective strategies where they've tested out this or that. They know what doesn't work for them and they know what does work. That's what we should be supporting. So finally, Syrians, unless the policies change very quickly, are on their own. And there's no specific single entity that has been tasked with their physical protection, including warning them of bombs, reinforcing their hospitals, building safety points, figuring out evacuation plans for them. I believe that America can help, and so many civilians have been killed. It's too late for us to help them, but it's not too late for us to help the Syrians who remain. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Kikuler?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for organizing this hearing to address the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria. This discussion is a reminder of the international community's collective failure to prevent mass atrocities, protect civilians, and bring the conflict in Syria to an end. I speak to you today as the Deputy Director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. At the core of the center's mission is the belief that timely global action by policymakers, advocates, and concerned citizens can prevent mass atrocities and catalyze an international response when they occur. As an institution devoted to the memory of the Holocaust, we understand all too well the consequences of inaction in the face of mass atrocities. The Congress, and in particular this Commission, have an important and essential role to play in fulfilling our collective responsibility to prevent, and in the case of Syria, respond to mass atrocity crimes. In the 5.5 years since the conflict in Syria began, more than 400,000 people have been killed. The government of Bashar al-Assad, the main, though not the only perpetrator of violence against Syrian civilians, is responsible for committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. As I speak, thousands of Syrians face daily torture in the country's notorious prisons and detention centers. In the cities and towns across the country, the Syrian government is intentionally preventing communities from accessing life-saving food, water, and medical treatment. And despite the recent ceasefire, civilians are yet again being killed by indiscriminate government airstrikes. As the Assad regime and its allies continue their targeting of civilian populations with impunity, two fundamental principles must remain at the heart of any policy discussion. One, protecting civilian populations must be a primary priority of any Syria policy discussion, not subservient to other near-term political interests or longer-term strategic interests. Inaction in the response to the targeting of civilians will only increase the current death toll, undermine any durable resolution of the conflict, and further threaten the security of the region and our own national security. Two, our U.S. policy must simultaneously strive to bring the conflict to a durable conclusion and protect civilians from ongoing mass atrocities. Three, the persistence of mass atrocities in Syria reinforces the importance of early preventive action in response to the risks of mass atrocities. The failure to act early contributes to a narrowing of policy options and increases the political, material, and human cost of later action. Protecting civilians under threat of these atrocities must be a primary priority of the international engagement on Syria for two main reasons. First and foremost, mass atrocities against Syrian civilians have devastated the Syrian people. Not since the Holocaust have mass atrocities and their effects been as well documented. From the photographs of the Syrian torture regime that Caesar, a former military photographer, brought before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to the images of Syrian refugees that have appeared on the front pages worldwide. Second, continuing mass atrocities in Syria poses a serious threat to U.S. strategic interests. In addition to its humanitarian consequences, the conflict in Syria has challenged our allies, emboldened our adversaries, and created a haven for actors like the self-proclaimed Islamic State that threaten our security. The continuing deliberate attacks on civilian populations makes resolution of the conflict much more difficult, prompts higher levels of displacement, and increases the risk of retaliatory spirals of violence in the years ahead. As President Obama stated in Presidential Study Directive 10, preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States. There are no easy options to address the crisis in Syria today, but that is true in all situations where mass atrocities occur. We cannot let a lack of imagination or a lack of a serious assessment of all options contribute to the commission of continued mass atrocities. All options must be closely considered and the evaluation of their potential efficacy an ongoing process. As conditions on the ground change, opportunities may emerge or close for the use of certain strategies by the United States, other governments, and local actors. As we rightfully debate the perceived costs and risks of taking more actions to protect civilians, we must weigh those against the well-understood costs of inaction or insufficient action. Protecting civilians will not be easy, and the gains will be incremental, but the alternative is simply unacceptable. The devastation of the Syrian people, the destruction of families, untold suffering that will affect generations to come. As survivor Elie Wiesel noted, whoever kills more than his victims. As long as the conflict continues, Syrians will face a threat of atrocities. Many have rightly observed that the surest way to end the atrocities is to bring the conflict to a durable conclusion. That could take years, if not decades. During that time, Syrian civilians must be protected from atrocities. These two approaches, trying to end the conflict and trying to support and protect civilians while the war continues, are both critical and complement one another. A comprehensive strategy involving, where applicable, a full range of coercive and non-coercive responses to protect civilian populations from mass atrocities must be considered and must reinforce a common political strategy that reflects evolving threats against Syrian civilians. Vigorous diplomacy with the warring parties and other influential actors is absolutely necessary, even in times when the prospects of a negotiated solution appears slim. As others have noted, non-military approaches, if carried out in full, have the potential to provide important relief to civilians under threat of mass atrocities. They include multilateral diplomacy, ceasefire agreements, and various means of civilian self-protection. In addition, in the past, the United States government has used a variety of military actions to protect civilians. Amongst those are no-fly zones, safe havens, and humanitarian corridors used, for example, in Iraq and Bosnia. These strategies were used to limit the ability of perpetrators to target civilians for atrocities by impairing their ability to target vulnerable communities. In the Syrian context, advocates have argued that these options would limit the Syrian government's use of airstrikes against civilian communities and humanitarian facilities, one of the main causes of civilian death and displacement in the Syrian conflict. Others have suggested that targeted strikes on military installations would be used as punishment for noncompliance with negotiated ceasefires and other specific protection demands, for example, to stop the use of indiscriminate aerial bombardment. Our center does not take a specific stance on which, if any, of these actions should be taken in Syria. We also recognize that these options are not an exhaustive list of available options. We do feel that it's critical that all options receive due consideration and that we're constantly innovating to try to identify new strategies for protecting civilians. It is important that people are specific about the language they're using, what they hope to achieve through both coercive and non-coercive action, and how these strategies will accomplish that goal. Atrocities are being perpetrated in a multitude of ways by multiple actors in various parts of the country. Each tactic used requires a specific strategy to address their commission in a specific locality. None of the options mentioned, by themselves or in combination, is a panacea. Each of these options also carries significant second and third order effects that policymakers should be prepared to confront. For example, the Syrian government, backed by Iranian and Russian forces and Hezbollah fighters, has demonstrated its willingness to increase the scale of violence against civilians and rebel forces in response to perceived threats from Western governments. As Syria and countless past cases have shown, the resolve of those committing atrocities against civilians is often greater than the resolve of those who seek to protect them. This imbalance will persist alongside the conflict in Syria as the stakes of the Syrian government's survival remain elevated. This challenge affects both coercive and non-coercive attempts to protect civilians from future atrocities. As perpetrators' tactics change, the international community is sadly often not willing to recalibrate its response to protect civilians from new threats on the ground. To conclude, the risks associated with these options reinforce the importance of investing in a broader agenda for preventing the types of atrocities that we've seen in Syria. The international community's failure in Syria during the last 5.5 years carries two important lessons for the prevention of future atrocities. First, a successful strategy to protect civilians requires that the U.S. government engage in early preventive action well before an atrocity unfolds. As the conflict in Syria has persisted, the challenge of preventing new atrocities by the Syrian government and others has grown ever larger. The political and financial costs of pursuing these actions has grown, and their potential efficacy has dwindled. Second, the successful prevention of mass atrocities requires that U.S. policymakers plan for all plausible scenarios that may lead to an escalation of mass atrocities. Much of the U.S. government's early response to the deterioration of the conflict in Syria appeared to rest on faulty assumptions about the likely actions and responses of the Syrian leadership. The situation on the ground can always get worse. Effective prevention requires that we plan better and more often for those worst-case scenarios. To our knowledge, there's been no systematic effort within the U.S. government to identify and learn from these and other lessons about its own Syria policy. We're engaged in our own research on this topic, but only an internal process can paint a complete picture of the analysis and decisions of U.S. officials during the last 5.5 years. The atrocity prevention mechanisms that the President established and institutionalized in his recent executive order, in particular the Atrocities Prevention Board, are well poised to facilitate this process with the full cooperation of all internal stakeholders. The recently introduced House Resolution 5732, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, includes limited provisions for assessing U.S. assistance programs in Syria. Going forward, the U.S. Congress can work to expand this request to include an evaluation of the broader U.S. policy process on Syria leading up to and since the onset of the crisis in March 2011. These actions are an important prerequisite for effective policy planning under the next U.S. administration. The next administration needs to be prepared for the possibility that mass atrocities in Syria will continue and in some scenarios get worse. A successful U.S. strategy to protect Syrian civilians will require a concerted effort to plan these scenarios, integrate all policy actions into a comprehensive political strategy, and above all, mobilize the political will to see those actions through. When I was last at the Syrian-Turkish border, a young woman who'd been a teacher in Syria said to me, "We believed in humanity more than we should have. We were naive." The Syrian people are desperate for a reprieve from the relentless atrocities perpetrated by the Assad regime. What little civilian protection exists is largely the work of courageous Syrians like the doctors working for the Syrian American Medical Society Foundation. Today, they're looking to the United States and to Congress for help. They're looking for us to muster the political will and courage to take action to save lives. They're looking to us to restore their faith in humanity. Thank you.
Engels, welcome. I gave you an introduction before you got here, so,
Thank you.
but I appreciate you being here. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Apologies for being late. Thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Chairman. And thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss atrocity accountability efforts underway in Syria. Let me take this opportunity to thank also the Commission for their commitment to help end the humanitarian crisis in Syria, bringing an end to the suffering of civilians and holding criminally accountable those responsible for atrocities committed is of paramount importance, not only to the United States, but indeed to the international community. I've been asked to provide answers to the following questions. What can be done now to ensure individual criminal responsibility in Syria? How the current problems preventing atrocity accountability can be best addressed? And what role the United States government can play in supporting and bolstering these accountability efforts. I will make 3 recommendations in response. First, the U.S. should support continuing criminal investigations even if political agreement on international jurisdiction over atrocity crimes is still lacking. With the Syrian war and associated atrocities being featured in headlines for years, there have been perpetual calls to investigate those specific individuals or groups responsible for the large number of crimes committed to date. As a result, many human rights organizations and the United Nations itself have engaged in a significant amount of work focused on the interviewing of victims and documenting of crimes. Although the work undertaken by these international entities and organizations is essential to transitional justice and criminal accountability in general, it is distinct from the work that we are doing at CIJA. Spurred by the experiences of international courts, we set out in Syria to establish the individual criminal responsibility of high-ranked leaders with respect to the very atrocities being documented by the UN and by other NGOs. More specifically, we focus on linking individuals with crimes. Our aim is to produce fully prepared case files that an international or domestic prosecutor would, in normal circumstances, submit prior to trial. In short, CIJA, an NGO, is replicating the work of an investigative unit of the International Criminal Court or similar body. This work was and remains necessary because geopolitics have prevented such action by already existing bodies. To date, CIJA has produced 5 case files implicating over 40 individuals reaching up the hierarchy of the Syrian regime. Second, accountability must remain on the international agenda for future peace in Syria while simultaneously pursuing current available avenues for justice. As encouraging as it is to see national avenues of accountability opening up, a process that CIJA supports in 8 different jurisdictions, it does not present an appropriate forum for full-scale criminal accountability, especially of the most responsible individuals. I must emphasize that justice cannot be seen as a luxury, or more importantly, as counterproductive or incompatible with a peace process. Quite the contrary, justice and peace are mutually reinforcing endeavors that, when pursued properly, offer the best chance of a durable peace. History has proven as much. One only need look at the countless failed ceasefires and peace deals that subsequently unraveled because of grievances about past atrocities when they were left unaddressed. In light of the above, the recent media reports that the administration has sidelined the House's Syria Civilian Protection Act are unfortunate. However, we are encouraged to see the progress of the House's Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act, and we urge representatives from both sides of the aisle to join and support holding atrocity criminals accountable and securing justice for victims of these horrible crimes. Third, the U.S. has a number of tools at its disposal which can be utilized to promote comprehensive justice. The United States should be developing a long-term strategy incorporating financial, diplomatic, and political tools to create international and domestic accountability mechanisms that can achieve comprehensive criminal justice. For instance, while supporting the systematic collection and legal analysis of evidence, as described above, the U.S. should consider sanctions, not just on Syrians implicated in atrocities, but also those complicit as aiders and abettors. The U.S. should also make it a priority to come to an agreement on a justice mechanism for Syria that takes into account the will of the Syrian people, whether this be a hybrid court, a regional court, or some other model of justice. U.S. efforts to help bring relief and accountability to Syria would be emblematic of some of the United States' best values: adherence to the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and the delivery of humanitarian assistance to those most in need. These values underpin a just and peaceful society and are especially sacred to those who must find a way to overcome the years of trying to transition out of the throes of chaos and tragedy that they have suffered. It is for these reasons that the Commission's engagement concerning the Syrian conflict and the associated atrocities is critically important to transitional justice in the region and advancing American interests in this process. Thank you very much for your continued engagement on this issue.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank all three of you for your testimony here today. Ms. Lewinsky, let me ask you a question. How has the civic analysis been received by other donors in the UN system?
Very well, but a lot of the donors in the UN system are giving sort of large pots of cash to humanitarian aid and not sorting it in the particular and I think smart way of saying, okay, we are going to direct this to Syrians helping themselves.
Right. So, are there any? I mean, you mentioned a number of things that could be done, are there any pilot projects underway to support the civilian self-protection strategies that you have described?
There are several, actually. So particularly on the early warning system side, there are several, I wouldn't call them companies, they're basically NGOs, but they're working with Syrians, PhDs, et cetera, to figure out better ways to give advanced warning. So there are pilot projects all over the country. The one that I mentioned about Idlib is hoping to start in Aleppo soon.
And is the U.S. supporting any of this directly, or?
The U.S. has been supporting early warning systems through ad hoc measures. So again, that large pot of aid funding that goes to USAID that might send it out on occasion to these early warning systems. So it needs to be a better strategy.
Right. So you're advocating a kind of a more direct strategy, more clear-cut strategy, and at a bigger scale.
Yes. Absolutely. And supporting these pilot projects. So I'm glad you mentioned the pilot projects because USAID staffers have the expertise to work with Syrians to create these on a much larger scale.
And it'd be helpful if you could maybe provide us in the Commission just some of the more details on the individual pilot projects so we could be better advocates on some of that stuff.
Yes, and I would like to do that not publicly. They're very worried about having.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so we're all very sensitive. So, however, but just so that we have we advocate to the administration that they should do X, Y, and Z. That we're basing it on, something that that's real that we could talk to them about.
Yes, and thank you for asking.
Yeah, and and I think all the stuff that you've talked about is incredibly important. I mean, there's part of me that kind of wants to say, oh no, I want this to be over with.
Yeah.
I want this to end. And so early warning systems and all this other stuff sounds like it's going to continue, which I think it may very well, but it's just a sad reality. I mean, I think absolutely we have to protect these people right now who are in facing the most dangerous situations. Our earlier panel, we talked about the direct humanitarian assistance, but people are being bombed every day and without warning, and they're in schools, they're in hospitals, they're just getting on with their lives. So there's, to the extent that they can be warned that of an impending attack and be able to protect themselves and their families would be very, very helpful.
And sir, just as you know, I think Syrians would agree with you that they want an end to this too, and they don't want to have to build
Right.
up these capacities. But in building up these capacities, none of it is lost. You're also training emergency medical providers. You're also rebuilding hospitals and schools, and you're giving them the technology capacities to rebuild their nation after it's done.
Yeah, Ms. Kiekoler, I mean, thank you for your testimony too. You talked about coercive actions to protect civilians, and here's kind of the what I always I wrestle with on that is that you know, and you mentioned kind of the lack of political will, that we need to develop more political will. I agree with you too on that, but here's the deal. I think when it comes to like dealing with refugees, I think it's clear we need to develop the political will, because this is what we need to do. We need to accept more Syrian refugees. We need to provide more assistance. We need to be working with the international community to protect those who are leaving. It just seems to me to be very, very clear. When it comes to coercive actions, you know, in Syria, it gets more complicated. So when you talk about our earlier panel, we talked about no-fly zones or safe zones. On one level, yeah, if we could create a safe zone, that'd be great. But it's more complicated than that. And you know, no-fly zones or getting directly involved, you know, in military action against the Syrian regime, you know, there's consequences to that. Then you have Russia that is involved, and then there's, you know, then there's the concern that you could actually, with good intentions, create a situation that doesn't protect civilians, that makes things worse. And so like I said, it just is less clear cut to me what coercive actions that we can take in Syria, you know, that I could feel relatively assured would work, and maybe you could respond to that. And the question is, does the United States or any other foreign country have a valid legal basis under international law to establish a safe zone or a no-fly zone in Syria without the Syrian government's assent?
Thank you for those questions. I think I just want to quickly start by restating again, we don't take an official position on what the response should be. Right. We do feel very strongly, though, and as was echoed in the first panel, that there needs to be a full and open and transparent discussion about what the options are,
so
and weighing.
You would agree with me that the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate ought to be debating, you know, this issue, and you know, I mean, and I believe that there ought to be, you know, that we ought to have an authorization of the use of military force that ought to be debated and voted on, so it's clear what the, you know, what the parameters of our involvement are going to be, and what we expect the administration to do. But maybe you can't take a position on that either. I don't know, but I just.
I think what I can say, Chairman, is the Syrian crisis. This is now the second U.S. election that the Syrian people are living in a period of conflict through, and it's the second time that their lives, to a certain degree, are in part, when we talk about an array of civilian protection options, being held, I don't want to say it at the mercy, but we are waiting to see what the outcomes of elections and new administrations will be. And as you said yourself, you know, it was a shame that more members could not be here today, and that this has to be an ongoing conversation. From the perspective of our institution, we're focused on trying to ensure that there are the institutions, the processes, and the decision-making apparatus that exists, not just for Syria, but for all cases, so that it doesn't matter if we're in an electoral cycle or not, we have got a clear response to the commission of atrocities that are unfolding. In regards to the options that exist today and the ones that we talked about, I think we highlighted our concern around kind of second and third order potential risks, but also the need for there to be creativity and innovation. We've talked about a few of the options that exist. There are others that are out there. There are others that potentially could be created, because the situation is constantly evolving, and the needs of particular communities vary based on what part of the country they're in and the types of atrocities that are being perpetrated against them. As a result, the U.S. government and others have to be going through a constant iterative process of trying to assess what strategies, both coercive and non-coercive, can be used at a particular moment to protect communities at that particular location as well. That requires dedicating resources to make sure that we're doing that type of constant evaluation, and that we're building the political will to act when we see that there are moments where we can perhaps do more to protect civilians. In regards to the legal question, right now, of course, through the UN Security Council, it's highly unlikely that we'd get an authorization for the use of force, even to protect civilians, despite the 2005 agreement for support for the responsibility to protect. And, you know, there are different options that experts have discussed, ranging from arguments around self-defense and an extension of the engagement around ISIS, to putting forth the notion that in keeping with the 2005 agreement with the responsibility to protect, one could, for example, bring to the Security Council a vote to create a safe haven or another option, have it vetoed, potentially go to the UN General Assembly. There are different routes and courses that people have outlined as a way of being able to show that perhaps while there might be traditional legality questions, in the interest of protecting civilians, it is morally justifiable. What that means is we're not that different from a legal perspective and an institutional perspective as we were in Kosovo, but I think that's unfortunately the situation that we may face. And again, that's more just for kind of educational purposes rather than suggesting that's the course that should be taken. Thank you.
No, and yeah, and look, I mean, we should have been asking these questions and doing these things long before this conflict even began, because I think there ought to be a clear-cut roadmap of what we in the international community should do in the face of some of the atrocities like we're seeing right now in Syria. And I also regret that, you know, we're in the middle of a political campaign season where everybody's walking on eggshells because no one wants to say anything that might be controversial because it just, you don't want to lose a vote. So people repeatedly say that, you know, how sorry we are about all that's going on, and, you know, we got to take tougher action, or we got to do this, but in vague terms. And it's not, I'm sure for a lot of the Syrian people who may be observing what's going on, it's not very reassuring because there's really no specificity. And even here in Congress, I'm going to go back to this, because I think that I give John Kerry an incredible amount of credit for trying to work out this ceasefire, and I think at this point we have to make that work somehow. That has to happen to stop the bombing, to be able to bring the humanitarian assistance to the people who need it, and to be able to help allow civil society to start figuring out what are the next steps. You know, so but I also believe that the United States Congress ought to be talking about these issues and debating these issues, because we have a constitutional responsibility in all of this that we're not living up to. And I think the reason why we're not doing it is because it's uncomfortable, and there are no easy answers, and there's no clear-cut, you know, do this and everything is going to be good, or do that, and you know, you solve the problem. And I think, you know, and it's not just on Syria. I would say it's on Iraq, it's on Afghanistan. I go right down the list of places that we've been avoiding. So I appreciate that. Mr. Engel, thank you for being here, and I share your view on the issue of accountability, and you know, and as somebody who's worked on human rights issues in a number of countries over the years, in places where this issue of accountability for atrocities and crimes against humanity are kind of brushed aside, things don't get better in that country. I mean, they end up decades later demanding justice. I mean, people can't move on, you know, from the horrors of actions like we see right now in Syria. And there is a line, and there has to be a line that people cross, is so horrible that, you know, there's no way to negotiate away any responsibility. I mean, there has to be a consequence. If not, then, you know, what's the incentive not to do it again, or to have somebody else do it and say, look, he got away with it, I can get away with it too. And I think that is, I feel very strongly about that. But can you describe kind of the primary challenges you face in building cases against Syrian government officials, and also in CIJA's examination of thousands of pages of Syrian government documents, what has surprised you most?
Thank you for the questions, Mr. Chairman. So the challenges are in general terms, are quite obvious, I suppose. We're doing something that hasn't been done before, and that is to try and conduct criminal investigations up to a high evidentiary standard during high-intensity armed conflict. So just as everyone else that is working in Syria faces those challenges, white helmets, those doctors who are going back into hospitals that they know might be bombed, the same issues arise with investigators on the ground trying to collect this information. As the dynamics of the conflict change, so do the challenges. The ability to collect evidence is, of course, something that requires a lot of work, a lot of precision, but more importantly, and more challenging today, is the movement of that material, because it is our desire to ensure that as quickly as possible, yet safely, we can move that evidence out of the conflict zone to a place where we can be quite assured that it will be safe, it will be archived, and it can be utilized both today in domestic courts in Europe and North America, and later on for what we hope will be a larger scale accountability mechanism, such as a hybrid court. Those are the issues that we face. I think the biggest surprise would be the precision, if you will, or the adherence to the policy which was provided at the highest levels of the regime in order to deal with the opposition, to deal with the crisis, as they called it. We have seen through the documentation that we have, as you know, I mentioned over 600,000 pages, that orders came from above at the highest levels in Damascus, and those orders went down the chain of command very clearly, very often with the exact same language, almost cut and pasted from the highest levels of the regime, and then moved down the chain of command. So the orders to implement and focus on financiers or facilitators or organizers of demonstrations, or those otherwise related to free press, those who were putting the regime in a negative light. Those orders came down to target those individuals. They came from Damascus, from the highest level. And then you see in the reporting that goes down that every layer tells the next layer down to target these individuals, which then, of course, as we all know, we know very well, was implemented. And not only was it implemented across the country very systematically. And then reports on exactly what they asked go back up to Damascus. Right. So the structure and the structural integrity that remains in place, and the adherence to the policy, which was driven from the highest levels and is implemented at the lowest levels, is quite impressive. And it paints a very clear picture of the understanding of the highest levels of the regime and indeed their responsibility.
Just one final question. I mean, are you able to make your investigations available for the purposes of encouraging the imposition of sanctions and, you know, and sharing some of this information that I think might be relevant in trying to figure out, you know, Syrian government decision-making and, you know, and how maybe potentially being useful and stuff that can be taken into consideration for our policymakers, you know, who are trying to seek a political resolution to this conflict. I'm not sure how that all works, but it just seems that this is information that, in addition to building a case, you know, there are things that could be done right this second, you know, in terms of imposing sanctions on individuals and entities, and also, you know, just trying to figure out, like, what does it take to, you know, to try to move this political process forward?
Yes, sir. Of course, as you know, our primary focus is on meeting this threshold,
Right.
individual criminal responsibility threshold. What that does allow, of course, is to ensure that the evidence and material we collect that meets that threshold will surely meet a lower threshold such as a threshold for sanctions. So indeed, the evidence could be utilized for that purpose as well. That is the reason that we indeed were very much supportive of the Syrian Civilian Protection Act, which includes a sanctions element.
And by the way, that may come up again. So I mean, that's I think in the House. I mean, I've heard a rumor that I probably shouldn't say this, but that it may be revisited. So that might be coming up sooner than we think. But anyway, just.
That's excellent news. And for us, I think that our standard is that we are engaged in this evidence collection in order to support accountability measures. So if it is a process which benefits and requires a higher level of documentation, and where chain of custody is important, and where the linkage evidence is important that we have, then indeed, yes, we would be open to that support as well.
So we need to vacate the room shortly, so I want to just give you an opportunity to make a final statement of anything that that you think needs to be said for the record. I will tell you this: I think this has been a really fascinating hearing, and we're going to try to make sure that this YouTube recording of this hearing is made available to every member, because I think this is the kind of stuff we ought to be thinking about and talking about, and I think all of you have kind of very unique perspectives on this that deserve more attention from Congress than we've been giving you. So I assure you this will be widely disseminated. But why don't we begin and let you summarize anything that you want to summarize?
Thank you, sir. Just a brief note that you're right that as soon as we dig into this conflict, it gets incredibly complicated. You could go down any number of rabbit holes when thinking about aid or a political settlement or a ceasefire, and I think for all of us it becomes untenable to figure out what we can do if we continue to go down those rabbit holes and get overwhelmed by the problem. I think what you've heard today are some really positive, concrete, actionable recommendations for what the United States government can do right now. And I would suggest to all of your colleagues to take those into consideration and get going, because the conflict isn't going anywhere, and Syrians, of course, are dying, which is what we all care about. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I used to have a history teacher who always used to say to me, don't tell me what you can't do, tell me what you can do. And it may not be everything, that we want to do, but I mean, there are things that you've outlined a number of things that we can do to protect people. That's important, keeping people alive. That's if we can do that, check one more person, it's worth it. So, Ms. Kigler.
Thank you very much. I think I would just echo Sarah's point and just underscore again that this conflict will persist and atrocities will continue to be a primary tactic used by the Assad regime to try to control the Syrian population, and we need to focus on strategies to provide immediate civilian protection and also long-term civilian protection for those communities. They won't be easy and the gains will be incremental, but we need to evaluate the situation constantly to look for opportunities and be creative with the types of strategies that we are using. I do want to thank you because hosting this discussion is actually exactly the type of leadership that we want to see Congress take on situations involving mass atrocities. And within the Genocide Prevention Task Force that the museum was an actor in helping to give birth to, one of the recommendations was that the Lantos Commission hosts these very types of hearings. And we hope that this becomes something that, as you said, your fellow members are aware of in terms of today's discussion. We look forward to further conversations in that regard. We also do think that it is important that there be a lessons learned process undertaken internally within the USG to assess the policy process since March 2011. And we look forward to talking with you and others about opportunities to ensure from a more institutional and process perspective that Congress receives annually an intelligence report of the risks of atrocities, that foreign services officers are trained to look for those warnings, but that we are doing everything we can to ensure that we're dedicating resources today to find innovative strategies to protect Syrians. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that, and we look forward to working with you, and we appreciate all the work that the museum does, and not only on this issue, but on issues like Sudan and so many other important issues that you have called attention to and you know, urged us to think more creatively and out of the box. But I think in terms of kind of establishing kind of a roadmap in advance of conflicts is something that we need to figure out how to work with you on to establish, because it's much more difficult to do when you're in the midst of a conflict, because, you know, but anyway, but thank you. Mr. Engels?
Thank you, sir. I think one final point would be to simply build on your points, the necessity for accountability both today and in the future in Syria. And that is something that we indeed take very seriously as well. In fact, the majority of our personnel on our Syria team are Syrians. And for them, this is not a process that ends at the end of the conflict. Indeed, it will only begin at that point. And so the energy and the time that we have spent working together with them to build their capacity in war crimes specific investigations, I think is something that not only benefits the building of cases today, but will indeed be of even more value later on, because that's the reason they're there. They're there because as lawyers and judges and law enforcement personnel, before the beginning of the conflict, they believe that this is their way to contribute to a future peaceful Syria. And so I think not only should we focus on the accountability and collection of evidence and building of cases today, but also be thinking about what does that justice look like tomorrow. And we have indeed failed often to prepare the justice system to handle these types of issues. And today we have the opportunity to continue to build that capacity, to have people who are incredibly supportive and engaged in this process now, who can potentially be the leaders of that process in a later future Syria.
Well, I agree. I appreciate it, and with your testimony, and I think to the extent that you're successful, will determine the future that Syria has when this conflict is over with. And again, accountability is incredibly important, and I get nervous sometimes when I hear people talk about political solutions where we could sweep this under the rug, we could look the other way on this, or look, you know, there's some things that are so horrendous that you can't do that. And if you do it, you will ensure that the future of Syria will continue to be troubled, even if you could somehow find an end to this current conflict. There has to be accountability. So. But I appreciate all of you for being here. I appreciate all the panelists. This has been very, very helpful, and I will share this hearing with my colleagues. So thank you very much. The hearing is adjourned.